Thank you, sir. Pleasure to be here as always. Let me begin by thanking India Foundation for having given us this opportunity. This is the second year in running. Last opportunity was a wonderful one, very educative for me, and I'm sure I have no doubts. So will this one be? Now, what I intend to do today is I must first admit, if somebody was to ask me today what exactly is the economic cost of terrorism, I do not know. And I'm saying this after a fairly deliberate research that I carried out into the subject, only to realize how difficult it is to actually pin down the economic cost of terrorism. So what I intend to do hereafter is to look at three issues primarily, as have been flashed on the viewpoint. I'll try and outline as to what is it that constitutes the economic cost of terrorism and terrorist finance. Thereafter, we'll look at an analysis of its impact through a number of case studies. Now, these case studies are individual case studies of specific events, they're case studies of specific regions, as well as larger case studies which involve countries. Now, it's through these case studies that I'd like to illustrate the point that I want to make today about what exactly is the implication and the possible cost of terrorism. Let me begin by coming to the constituents. Now, very briefly, if you were to divide the constituents, you can divide them into two. The cost to an individual, which to my mind is actually the biggest cost that terrorism imposes in any region. And the second is, of course, the structural or the area-related issues that come up. In both these, you find that the costs can either be direct or they can be indirect. Let's take the example to an individual. The loss of life is a direct cost of terrorism. Injuries are direct cost of terrorism. Medical support in terms of the money that is spent, direct costs. The legal costs that a person has to bear are again the cost of terrorism. But beyond that, if you look, what is the money that that individual would have earned over a lifespan? These are the indirect costs of terrorism. The cost of opportunities which have been lost. I am affected individually, let's say, because of a terrorist attack. What are the opportunities that my children have lost because of that? There is no calculation for it. And this is the massive cost that any area, any region actually bears when it is affected by terrorism. The same is when we look at the institutional issues. You've raised certain forces. These are the institutional costs that you bear. You've raised certain forces, you've raised certain organizational structures. But beyond that, what is it that has happened? What happens to the economy of that country? What happens to the FDI that was to come into that country? What happens in terms of the sentiment that it affects when it comes to that country or that region? And some of the case studies that I'm going to show you today will actually more than amplify the issues that I have raised. Let me get on to each one of them. Let's look at the first one. Now, before I come to the specific case study, this is one of the analysis at the macro level that has been done in terms of what is the quantum of impact of terrorism. Look at the breakup that has been given here. The cost to an individual, which is, as I said, the major component. Thereafter is the cost to the economy, the GDP of a country. And the figures that have been given here are figures for 2015. I hope everybody can read it at the back. And thereafter, of course, are issues related to injuries and other peripheral issues. So it's again the individual which bears the biggest brunt of something of this kind. Now, if you were to look at the major countries which are affected by this, look at these figures. Now, this is the impact on a country's GDP in a descending order. And not surprisingly, you find West Asia, you find the northern part of Africa, and you find the APAC region, which bears the maximum brunt of terrorism and its economic costs. Interestingly, you will also find Pakistan here, and I'm specifically referring to it not because it bears the highest cost, but because there is a relation to the case studies that I'm going to be talking about a little later. Let's look at some of the individual cases first. 9/11, there's a lot of research which has been carried out on it, and this in gist refers to the economic cost of what happened. And the offices there, the individuals and immediate surroundings is listed here a little over $21 billion. The insurance costs of the attack went up to about $40 billion. Now these were the direct costs that you saw because of 9/11. Now let's look at the indirect costs. You had insurance rates shoot up, which means that the cost of insuring an individual, the cost of insuring an institution, a financial service, everything went up. Look at the budget that the US had pre and post 9/11. So from approximately $20 billion, it went up in the range of about $100 billion, which is a huge jump which happened post 9/11. What you also see that the intelligence costs alone, as has been revealed in the Snowden papers, is a little more than $16 billion in 2013. So a huge quantum jump that the economic cost turned out to be. Let's look at our own version of 9/11, 26/11. And let me give a caveat before I go any further. This is a huge understatement of what probably the cost must have been, because we do not have similar kind of figures post 26/11. But here is some of the things that I have been able to glean out. Let me bring that out for you. The cost that the insurance companies had to bear post 26/11 was about 400 crores. And just to give you a reference, the cost before this was in the range of 1.5 crores, and the cost thereafter have been in the range of about 2.5 crores. So a huge jump because of that. Again, to illustrate some of the examples thereafter, the Oberoi Hotel there, $45 million was the cost of reconstruction of that hotel. And till December, the same year, you had business coming down by 70%, not only that hotel, but the entire group. Of course, not to mention that 2008 was a downturn year, so partly it was because of that. But this did have a major impact on the tourism industry, on the insurance industry, the banking industry. The indirect cost, like I said, the insurance cost actually went up, which is partly the reason why you had the kind of impact that it had on insuring institutions thereafter. You also have the cost of providing security, the number of institutional structures that came up thereafter, the number of private structures that had to be created by establishments to give themselves security. Now, here is an example which the chair, of course, is the genesis of the data that I'm going to be flashing hereafter, having been the principal sponsor of the study, the Economic Survey 2016 of J&K. And I think it's a brilliant document, all of you need to look at it. Here is a comparison between two hilly states in India, J&K and Himachal. And just look at the figures that the economic survey gives. You look at the area, J&K is almost twice as big. You look at the population, twice as big. You look at the area under cultivation, over 2 lakh hectares more. The forest covered 20% both the states. But what happens after that? You look at things like the area which has been harnessed for electricity, and it's just half, or rather the electricity that has been provided, half in terms of the output that has been given. You look at the per capita, you look at the state GDP, in every single parameter, the state has suffered. Now, to illustrate as to how this suffering has happened, there is a very interesting slide which will tell you as to what exactly has been the specific impact last year of the terrorism which has been unleashed in the state thanks to Pakistan, and the unrest as a result of the same. The total cost that has been pegged here of the unrest for 5 months is 16,000 crores. And again, this is my assessment, of course the chair will know much better. I think this is yet again, like most other factors, an undervaluation of the actual cost that an individual and institution would have had to bear in the state. Now, out of this, over 6,000 crores each, the private and the government businesses had to pay, which is a major hit again on the ability of the state to generate money or to provide the goods to the services to the people. Now, besides that, you look at other elements, which again it's very difficult to look at it in terms of cost. What happens to the fact that people could not cover half the syllabus in schools? What is the extended cost of that? The fact that 31 schools were gutted. Now, these are intangibles which are extremely difficult to quantify. It's not the cost of rebuilding the school alone. It's the cost of the lack of provision of education, which is, I think, is a very important factor which needs to be outlined. Look at what happened for banking. 30% less credit which was dispersed. And besides that, look at the NPAs, how they went up. So in every single segment, every single sector, you find that it was adversely affected. Now, here is a slide, a lot of figures. Briefly, just what I want to tell you is every single area which benefits from tourism in J&K. Look at the 2015 figures, first quarter, second quarter. Look at 2016. First quarter, excellent, almost twice as much as 2015. What happens in the second quarter? It goes down dramatically as a result of the disturbance of finance. Alright. Now this is, I've tried to quantify here the structural cost that terrorism bears. I have not taken any institution, any service, any of the police forces which incidentally are deployed in CI operations. Here are the forces which are meant to be deployed in CI. The cost of that, as per the figures that I've stated, is a little over 19,000 crores per annum. A fair bit of cost, structural cost alone. Now, it would seem, of course, that the country which perpetuates a lot of this violence is possibly succeeding in terms of what it is doing. Which is why specifically I have this slide for you. This is indicating the number of deaths which have taken place in Pakistan, the casualties as given on in the blue columns, the GDP which is on the red line, and the green line has the FDIs flowing into the country. And you realize that the ghosts which have been created by the country are actually going back to affect them far more than they have affected India. Look at the figures of GDP. More importantly, look at how, despite the casualties coming down in the last few years, the FDI has not gone up. The nature of sentiment suggests that no one would like to invest in a country which is the kind that Pakistan has ended up becoming today. I thought it was extremely important to give you this. Look at the FDIs of India in comparison. Irrespective of the casualties, you have an upper trajectory which is more or less immune from the kind of casualties which are taking place. Again, the sentiment is positive. So irrespective of what has been attempted, it has not really been able to have the kind of economic impact which possibly was desirable by that. Okay. Now, let's look at, just 3 more minutes, the terror finance angle. Now, these are the elements which are affected because of terror finance. Businesses, individuals again, structures, but let me try and give you just 2 quick case studies because I don't have much time. I will, let me skip this, I think I'll be overshooting my time. Let me give you this case study. Now, it's as simple as how terror finance affects the entire economy of a region, which is the economy of terror. I need to buy paper. If let's say extortion is taking place, the trucking cost goes up. The businessman is extorted, the cost of his business goes up, and that is the wholesaler. The retailer is extorted, his cost of doing business goes up. Because of what happens is, he delivers either a lower volume or a higher cost to the consumer. The consumer is forced to increase his outlay. He has no choice because he needs what he wanted to buy. Once that happens, the demand rises. Because of the demand, everybody is making more money. From the terrorist who's extorting to the businesses who want to take their pie out of it. And with the result, the cost of everything that is involved in this entire cycle is going up. And if the institutional agencies are also involved in corruption, then it is a double whammy. It's not only being built by the terrorists, it's also being built by the state agencies. So terrorism benefiting everyone here. Let's look at just one example before I come to the conclusion, and that's the banking catch-22. Now banks, in order to give services, must make it as simple, as basic as is possible to get in the common man, the poor man. The AML, anti-money laundering, counter-terror finance requirements bring a lot of cost to the banking. As a result of which, the terror finance, if that has to be stopped, your banking costs are going up because of the number of measures that have to be taken. If the banking costs are going up, the cost that I as a consumer have to pay for that banking goes up too. I might be able to bear the cost, but a poor man who has to pay more does not go to the bank and wants to try other means. If the bank realizes that the customer is going away and lowers the AML costs, the terrorist is back in motion. So you raise the costs, the consumers don't come. You lower the costs, the terrorists take advantage. So this is the kind of catch-22 situation a lot of banks are in, and there's a huge cost in terms of AML and CFT that have come. Let me come to the concluding observations before I finish. The first is terrorism still is the lowest cost option that is available against a state, and which is why it is being exploited the manner in which we've seen the kind of economic costs that it means to the state. An individual, of course, suffers the maximum economic cost when it comes to terrorism. Beyond the immediate numbers as we've seen, there is a cascading cost to the family, to the extended family that an individual has to bear. Costs are, of course, both direct and indirect. We see the indirect cost, often not being able to see the indirect cost. There is a centrifugal impact of terrorism. If there is a problem of tourism in Kashmir, and the figures suggest that, the number of tourists going to Ladakh and Jammu also go down. So it's not merely the region itself, the region around it also gets adversely affected. Now, J&K is a case study of how the regressive impact of terrorism has actually affected the common man. I've shown you the linkage of GDP, FDI as far as the economic costs are concerned. The challenge is to quarantine the economic costs from the events that are happening. And that is the challenge for any government. There is a cost-benefit ratio between the measures you apply and the benefits you're going to get. And there has to be a median somewhere that you choose. You cannot keep pumping in money hoping that you will stop terrorism and terror finance. And that is the difficult decision for any government. And finally, Pakistan's strategy of attempting to fuel terrorism in India has obviously failed given the cost that it has been to the state itself. Thank you.